Hi, everybody. This is Sam Hanley at Southport High School with you today to share some information about the AP test coming up in May, really specifically about the rhetorical analysis prompt. Hopefully, by now, you've received some feedback from your mock exam. That rhetorical analysis prompt we're going to look at today is that question number 2 on the mock exam, the one where you had to write about Gandhi and his peaceful protest, encouraging some nonviolent protest against the British in the light of salt taxation. We're going to come back to that in just a second. Our goal today is not going to be to look at the whole essay, or excuse me, the whole letter that Gandhi wrote. It is going to be to look at the prompt and kind of tackle how we deal with rhetorical situation just looking at those prompts. So our goal today is to understand, one, that everything has an audience, everything, all of it, right? We're going to look specifically at what Gandhi, who Gandhi was writing to today, and also we'll take a look at another prompt here at the end of the presentation. Again, we're going to deconstruct a rhetorical analysis prompt and try to use it as a lens for analysis, right? What does that mean? A lens is something you look through, right? It colors what you see. It focuses what you might be looking for, just like a camera lens does. That's what we're going to do today, is use that prompt to really focus on what we're going to look for as we do tackle those subject texts they'll give us for rhetorical analysis. We are going to read some passages today, and I'll show you how to get to those, but that's not going to be really the focus of today's presentation. The focus of today is going to be looking at the prompt itself. And finally, we're going to look at how we can start writing rhetorical analysis thesis statements, which I know you are pros at. But if there was some frustration maybe on your mock exam, or maybe you just need a refresher on that, we're going to look at some ways to make sure that we embed that rhetorical purpose into our thesis statements, certainly into the first paragraphs of our essays. To be successful today, you're going to need these things. As we go through this today, I'll tell you how to get those 2019 and the 2017 rhetorical analysis prompts if you don't have them already. It'd be really helpful if you have your essay from the mock exam there in front of you, so you could refer back to that. We're going to talk about using SOAPStone. Maybe you use SpaceCat or another way to organize rhetorical purpose. With this video, you will see a link to a SOAPStone organizer that I have for you. It'd be nice if you had that either printed or open on your desktop. And, just have some paper for notes, right? Because all good students are going to be taking notes, asking questions, or if you get bored, you need some place to doodle. So just a real quick reminder of what rhetorical analysis is not. It is not a vocab test. It is not a word search. And it is certainly not an exercise in summary. The goal today is really to get you to see the big picture, right? To make it big and maybe a little less menacing than trying to think of all of those vocab words that you might have had to take on a test earlier this year. Those sort of rhetorical devices, I'm not going to say they're not important. I think that the person with the most words does win, and that it's important to have precise vocabulary. But for this test, you don't need to remember them. What you need to really focus on, and we'll talk more about that in this lesson today, is author's purpose, right? And that rhetorical situation, and then just a few things that an author might do to kind of combine those elements. It is not an exercise in summary either. As you read back through your mock exam, I want you to just be honest with yourself. How much of what you wrote, especially in those body paragraphs, is summary? So I'm going to just take a quick second on that scrap paper and think about, what are some things authors do to change their meaning? How do they use style to change their meaning? And if you don't want to do that, then take a couple seconds to look at that awesome picture of a dude with a mullet and a mustache. Hit pause, jot down a couple ideas, and I'll come right back to you. Okay, so on your list, you probably have some things like word choice. You have some things like sentence structure. And I want you to think about all the stuff you talked about with your teacher in class this year, all of those things that fall under the umbrella of word choice, things that create tone, all of those big fancy words that might have to do with syntax or sentence structure, right? You probably remember words like alliteration. You probably remember words like parallelism. There's just a litany of rhetorical devices. Those are important, but I want you to ask yourselves right now, do they really work to achieve meaning? I want you tonight to try to get $20 off of your mom or dad. I don't know what you're going to do with it. It's not like you can go anywhere right now, but you try to borrow $20 using alliteration. If you can do it and alliteration is the device that worked for you, then go back to that main screen and email me. And if you can convince me, I'll send you $20. The point being, guys, you probably can't do it, right? So what we need to really look for are the things that work, not necessarily the first things that we see. And we'll remember back to the very beginning of the AP course when you probably saw something like this, right? That's what we're going to focus on today. First, we're going to focus on the left of this screen. You'll see SOAPStone, which is something that I'm sure you remember. If you don't remember it, now's a really good time to jot it down or open up that graphic organizer that I've included with the video. On the right, you're going to see what my students have seen and have filled out in class before, a rhetorical analysis triangle or a rhetorical triangle. Where it reminds us that all of these things are related so that the speaker can get to his or her goal. None of these things, in other words, live in a vacuum. I think we can come back to this and remind ourselves that maybe as we organize our essays, it isn't the best idea to write just about word choice or just about syntax, that we have to remember that they all are interrelated. Now let's talk about some things that we already know, like SOAPStone, and apply it to that prompt. And I know you guys have read this before, so I'll go very quickly through this, but I do want to make sure that we read it together and we just take a second to think about it. This year on the test, you're going to have 45 minutes to read one of these prompts, to read the subject, the text that goes with it, and to write your essay. We need to be proficient at that. If not quick, then we certainly need to be careful. So here's what he said, or here's what the prompt said. In 1930, Mohandas Mahatma Gandhi led a nonviolent march in India protesting Britain's colonial monopoly on and taxation of an essential resource, salt. The Salt March, as it came to be known, was a triggering moment for the larger civil disobedience movement that eventually won India independence from Britain in 1947. Shortly before the Salt March, Gandhi had written to Viceroy Lord Irwin, the representative of the British Crown in India. The passage below is the conclusion of that letter. Read the passage carefully. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze the rhetorical choices Gandhi makes to present his case to Lord Irwin. So one of the points I want to make before we move on here is we can get a ton of information just by reading the prompt. If we think about SOAPStone, there's already a litany of things here, right? There's a ton of information that we can go ahead and just put on our SOAPStone graphic organizer, and we're going to do that here in just a second. But before we go any further, the question at the bottom, what is it? And this is one of those places where students tend to go off the rails. If you don't, in your introductory paragraph, really underscore that you know what it is you are reading by correctly identifying it, it's not very impressive, especially to those AP readers. Remember, this year you get one essay to make a good impression. Let's make sure that that essay is, at the very least, accurate. This is not a story. It's not an essay. It's not a speech. It's not a volume of springtime haiku. It is the conclusion of a letter, right? You can see there in the second to last line, it says the passage below is the conclusion of a letter, right? It's not even the whole letter. We're going to come back to a way we can use that. But before we go any further, folks, it is really important to get that accurate. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about what we can learn from the prompt. I'm going to come out here in just a second and go ahead and add into my screen so you can see it as you maybe add onto your screen as well, right? So we know that this is Gandhi. And I can never spell his name right, but I think I got it right there. The prompt also told us, as we go back and forth here, right, that he is leading a non-violent march, that he is about civil disobedience. You probably already know who Gandhi is, but if you didn't, those are some things that we can pull from the prompt right now. We can say that he is nonviolent, that he is civil, he is about civil disobedience. Um, Another word that I never had, disobedience, right? And that he is for Indian independence. The occasion, right? Oops, I also cannot spell independence. Sorry about that. Remember, spelling does not count that much on the test. The occasion, right? The British have taxed salt, and that is bad. Who is the audience, right? This was really specifically said in our prompts. So go back to it in just a second, right? It's not the British people. It's not the people of India. It is a letter. Letters, friends, have one very specific person to whom they are intended, right, or for whom they are intended. This one is Viceroy Lord Irwin, the representative of the British Crown in India. In other words, the king's main dude in India at the time. So this is Viceroy Lord Irwin, representative of the king. Okay. I think we can probably go ahead and also either assume his purpose. I go back to the prompt to find out if maybe there is some hints in here at least. I think that we can probably say that his purpose is going to be like, hey, you know what? This taxation of our essential resource, salt, is a bad thing, right? So let's start with that assumption and see if our reading of the prompt bears out that assumption, right? So taxation of salt is bad, and let's do something nonviolent, of course, right? Because he mentioned that about it. The same thing here we can say with subject. I know that purpose and subject to me in the SOAPStone organizer always sort of like were confusing about how to tell the difference between which is which, right? But the subject here really is the taxation of salt and his response to it, right? So we're going to come back to those in just a second. I don't know that we can assume tone just by looking at the prompt, but I want you to say, guys, we just found 5 of those 6 things by looking no further than the prompt. I think that and I've read a lot of these, but I think it's a fair assumption to say that you're going to be able to do this with whatever prompt you are given. When you sit down on May 20th, in other words, take a second, look at the prompt before you start reading to see if you can find these things. Okay, so we'll go back to the presenting here. I want you to think about, what are some of those things that we look for when reading? We went back to at the very beginning. I asked you to jot down what do authors do. I want you now to think about this specifically. You're good annotators. You've been doing this all year. You now know that you're going to have to read a letter, and that letter was written by somebody who was trying to promote nonviolence. He was trying to promote civil disobedience, but he was also trying to get something done, right? So, what are the things that you think he might be employing? Let's just make some predictions here in order to get something done. I'm going to have you pause for just a second, use your scrap paper, jot down some of those predictions, and we'll come back together here in just a minute or two. Okay, now that you have made those predictions, I'm going to go ahead and give you some of my predictions. I was doing the same thing while you were working, right? So this is the end of a letter. I'm going to predict just a few things. One, that he's going to be forceful yet conciliatory, right? And conciliatory means agreeable. We know that because he wants to be he wants to get his job done here and to stay nonviolent about it. Other things that we look for when reading, I'm going to look for maybe some shifts that we have to see if he goes from one maybe tone to another tone. That's certainly something to look for as we read through this. Let's look for patterns of diction, right, of word choice. Do we see words in here that are forceful, that are conciliatory to talk about that tone that we predicted at the beginning? Um, are there patterns in here where he is directly addressing his audience, maybe, because we know this is a letter? And because we know that he has an argument to be made here, and that we have studied some good techniques for argument in our classes, um, you know, is he presenting his argument with counter argument? Do we see evidence? Right? What are some of those things that we see? Again, I spelled conciliatory wrong, and that's going to drive some of you crazy. So I better fix that before I move on. Right? So just a couple things that we might look for as we start our reading here. Go back to the presentation. Um, I want to, oh yeah, this slide. I forgot this was in here. I do want to remind you, and I show my students this from time to time, that a really important thing not to forget is to look out for those oh shift moments, with the F being very important in that word. That is when authors make meaning. When we see a change from time or place or tone or meaning, those are times when we really can be especially careful to look for what an author is doing. Okay, now what I want you to do is take a second and reread your essay, and I want you to reread that prompt text, right? What did Gandhi say in the conclusion to his letter to Viceroy Lord Irwin? Take a second, read them, do it. It won't hurt you. Hit pause. We'll come back together in a minute or two. Okay. I hope you spent some time reading. If you didn't, then you just listened to an awkward pause for no particular reason. I got to tell you right now, folks, that reflection on what you have written and rereading something is a really important skill in this class. Again, if you didn't go back and reread, the only person you are cheating is you. And to be honest with you, what better do you have to do right now? So I'm going to just assume that you all read it. So here's what I want you to do with this information today. On the left of this slide is just a sort of a model, right? A template, an equation, I guess, for putting together. It's not necessarily a thesis statement, but a statement at the beginning of your essay that might lead to a thesis statement, right? Um, I like these essays that just jump right in to get the job done. There's no sense in having an introduction here that's fancy or formal or unnecessarily floral, I suppose, when you don't have to. Let's just jump right in and say who is it and what is he or she doing. So I'll kind of walk you through this a little bit. You can see my cursor there. We're going to start with the author's name plus an appositive phrase. Remember that a positive phrase modifies before it. So in my example, we have Mohandas Gandhi, a proponent of nonviolent civil disobedience, right? And then the second thing, remember what I said earlier. It's really important to identify specifically what it is we are looking at. So I'm going to put, for the second part of my sentence, in the conclusion of his letter to Viceroy Lord Irwin, right? That is super important. If the title is there, then make sure you put the title in quotes if it should be, or underlined if you're reading a book, which it probably won't be. But that is super important, right? Let's get that right, if nothing else. If you don't get that right, and I'll be frank with you here, it is just lazy, because the prompt will tell you what it is you're reading. Then we're going to use a strong verb, right? The strong verb I used was asserts. That, right? And here's the clause that sort of says what the author's purpose is. Asserts that a peaceful protest is the best way to achieve his goal of making the British see the wrong they have done to the people of India. Now, that is a big chunk of a thesis statement right there. It doesn't necessarily give us the how, right? It doesn't necessarily say that he used rhetorical devices to get it done. But if let's just imagine for a second that we used this sort of sentence model as the first sentence for our rhetorical analysis essay. It is clear, it is direct, and it leads us right to the next sentence, right? The because, right? That how did he get it done? That is for another lesson, which hopefully, if you go back to look at your thesis statements, you'll make sure that you identified some of those rhetorical devices that he used, or some of those strategies that he used. But I'm going to guess right now that if you lost any points for the thesis statement, uh, and I've read a lot of these, that the weaker ones forget that purpose, right? They might say that Gandhi uses that he uses forceful diction. They might say that he adopts a conciliatory tone, right? But they miss sometimes the purpose. And I want to remind you that we had an idea of what his purpose was going to be without even reading the subject text, right? We hadn't even read the letter. And just from the prompt, we were assuming that his purpose was to say, hey, British, not cool, don't tax us, and we're going to have to do something about it. If we don't say that, friends, I go back to this, and I don't mean to be too forceful here, or I guess too mean about this. It's just lazy, because the prompt will usually tell us not only what the subject is that we're reading, what kind of text it's going to be, but also what the purpose of the text is going to be. Now, let's try this with a new prompt. If you've already read this prompt, you can go on to the AP website, and I'll show you that here in just a second, and come up with any other prompt you want. Just make sure you're looking at question 2. This one's from 2017. I'd like for you to tackle it, and using that handout that I gave you, go ahead and SOAPStone it and see how much of that you can get just by reading that prompt. When you're finished with it, it might be something you turn into your teachers. It might be something you use to start a conversation. It also might be something you use down the road when you take that test. Remember, it is going to be open note and open book. For this class, that means we need to make sure that we have in front of us on paper those things that help us remember to do good rhetorical analysis. This is certainly one of those tools. So hopefully this was a good lesson in remembering how to use SOAPStone to come up with a lens for analysis, to make sure that we include in our introductory paragraphs an accurate representation of what it is that we're reading, who the author is and who the audience is. And I thank you for listening today. Have a great end of your school year, and good luck on that test in May.